Judge Grayson assumed he was ready to sentence an adolescent who was completely uninformed of the circumstances. Until the defendant began to break down the case like a trained lawyer. The atmosphere in the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, bordering on oppressive. The public gallery was packed, with rows of onlookers chatting quietly to one another as they watched the action develop. The defendant's table appeared to be too large for the young man standing near it. Hands put in his pockets, chin up just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, 19, was charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The allegations were serious, but Judge Walter Grayson's expression indicated that the true trial had nothing to do with legality. Grayson relaxed in his chair, his fingertips lightly touching the glossy surface of the desk, looking down at Jalen between the rims of his spectacles. His lips contorted into the shape of a smile or sneer. "Do you regard yourself as a legal expert?" His demeanor was tinged with sarcasm. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few laughs filled the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, the bailiff, and the stenographer participated in the jocularity. In spite of this, Jalen maintained his composure. There were no smiles for him. He spent years preparing for this moment. Not exactly at this time, as he never imagined himself in this position, but he was as familiar with a courtroom as he was with himself. While other children remembered basketball statistics, he studied case law. While his peers played video games, he imagined mock trials in his thoughts, arguing hypothetical matters alone. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades, and Jalen grew up hearing stories of prosecutors cutting shortcuts, judges displaying partiality, and certain defense attorneys putting in little effort. At 14, he could evaluate a trial better than most law students. Grayson, however, saw none of this as relevant. Jalen was simply another disturbed teenager. "Let's keep this brief," the judge groaned as she opened the case file. "I have a golf game at 2, elicited another snicker from the audience. But this time something changed. Jalen's lips twisted into a small, virtually unnoticeable grin, as Grayson had just made his first error, and the courtroom had yet to catch on. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood from his seat with the manner of someone who thought he had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie was neatly tied, and his voice echoed with the seasoned assurance of someone who has given the identical speech hundreds of times before. "Your Honor, the state will demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that defendant Jalen Dawson was caught in the act with a stolen car, a 2022 Audi A6. That was reported stolen only hours before his arrest. Officers tracked him across downtown, and he allegedly tried to run before being arrested. His fingerprints were discovered on the steering wheel, and the prosecution believes that the evidence speaks for itself." The remarks bore a great weight, leading the crowd in the gallery to stir and whisper to one another. On the surface, it seemed damning, a stolen automobile resulting in a pursuit. Judge Grayson cast a glimpse at Jalen over the side of his spectacles before returning his focus to Carrington. "Please proceed." The prosecutor stepped toward the jury box, his shiny shoes tapping against the floor. "The defense may attempt to tell you that this was all a mistake, that Mr. Dawson is only an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He locked eyes with Jalen for the first time and proclaimed, "But let's be honest, what sort of victim flees the police?" Tension rose in the chamber, and Judge Grayson leaned in, resting his chin with his palm. Jalen did not blink. Carrington proceeded to rummage through a mound of documents. "Your Honor, I have the evidence of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who directly watched the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee. The automobile was verified stolen, and the arrest followed appropriate protocol." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds basic to me." For many in the audience, it probably did look that way. A simple case involving a stolen vehicle, a pursuit, and eventual arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years researching trials to see any anomalies. He remained calm, observing and waited. Judge Grayson softly tapped the gavel. "All right. Let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jalen's lawyer, Lisa Thornton, a public defender who had just uttered 3 words since entering the courtroom. She stood there, squirming uneasily. "Your Honor." My client, Jalen placed his hand on her arm, sending a quiet gesture. She paused, then sat down, and for the first time, Jalen spoke up, "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." The courtroom became completely quiet. Grayson gazed at him, evidently amused. "You'll do what?" Jalen's voice was calm and steady. "I will be defending myself." A murmur echoed across the courtroom, and the bailiff's eyebrows lifted in astonishment. Carrington's sneer faded before he broke out laughing. This should be entertaining. But no one laughed when Jalen walked up for the first time. Since everything was about to change, the weight of the courtroom surrounded Jalen as he shifted his stance, hands still stuffed in his pockets. He allowed the silence to last just long enough to make him uncomfortable before saying, "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Carrington lifted an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen took a measured step forward. "You mentioned that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally observed me behind the wheel before my arrest." "Correct." Carrington breathed quickly, having already lost interest. "That's correct. Is that testimony included in his report?" Jalen nodded and looked to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Grayson narrowed his gaze at him. "On what basis?" Jalen took his hands out of his pockets for the first time, indicating toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never seen me in that car. In reality, he wasn't on duty when the pursuit began." Carrington's expression became confused. "What are your suggestions?" Jalen took another stride ahead. "If granted, Your Honor, I would want to obtain verification of Officer Ruiz's GPS data from that night. If his report shows that he saw me in the car, that should be consistent with his location history." He let the term linger. "I doubt it will." The whispers in the gallery became louder. Grayson frowned, glancing at Carrington. "Counselor." Carrington cleared his throat as his jaw tightened. "Your Honor." The report was presented by a law enforcement officer. Are we really going to believe a defendant over a competent professional? Jalen gave a tiny, almost nonchalant shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will confirm that. But if he wasn't, his sentence faltered. Grayson studied him for a long time before approaching Carrington. Does the prosecution oppose to validating the officer's GPS logs? Carrington paused for just long enough for the jury, gallery, and, most crucially, the judge to notice. Jalen took a calm breath. He had spent years studying cases, examining prosecutors, their techniques, and how they worked their way through the system. And he knew one thing for certain: if Carrington was confident in his case, he would not hesitate. Grayson groaned and rubbed his temple. "Counselor." Carrington eventually shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the tide had already started to change. For the first time, no one laughed in court. The environment was hushed, yet the stress was palpable. Carrington shuffled his papers, his once polished confidence beginning to fade. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the reality remains that the defendant's fingerprints were discovered on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen nodded softly, his face incomprehensible. "That's true," he said, taking a step forward. "But first, let's look at the evidence." Grayson cocked an eyebrow, urging for Jalen to continue. Jalen addressed the jury, establishing eye contact with each individual. "The prosecution wants you to assume that discovering my fingerprints on a car means I stole it. That's the story they're telling. But let us think about this logically." He inhaled slowly, retaining a calm and steady tone. Consider stepping into a department shop, trying on a jacket, maybe placing your hands in the pockets, zipping it up, then returning it to the rack as you leave. Someone later steals the jacket from the store. Would your fingerprints on it indicate that you stole it? Some jurors exchanged eyes, causing a stir in the spectators. Jalen pressed on, not allowing them time to recuperate. The automobile in issue was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft took place. I was inside the store with 3 companions, and I did lean against the automobile as we passed it. I even opened the door, which was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it, didn't drive it, and didn't take anything from inside, just a moment of reckless curiosity. He paused for a moment before asking, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, "Does touching anything make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat and thumbed through his papers, looking for something, anything, to regain his grasp. But Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're discussing this topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was performed. He smiled at Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic expert in this instance called to testify?" Grayson blinked, taken aback by the inquiry, and looked at Carrington. The prosecutor paused, then reluctantly said, "No." Jalen pushed his lips together. "So, let me clarify, the state is using forensic evidence to convict me, but they did not feel it necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. I am denied the ability to cross-examine, inquire about the chain of custody, or question the correctness of the analysis." Carrington's jaws constricted. Jalen nodded, as if it was all the confirmation he required. "Interesting," Judge Grayson murmured and pinched the bridge of his nose. It was a realization that this case was not going to be as easy as he had hoped. But Jalen was far from done. The next thing he said would change everything. Jalen walked forward slowly, his voice calm yet firm. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." The judge gave a sigh. "Who is the owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave the police a statement that, for some reason, was missing from the prosecution's files. And I think I know why." He looked toward Carrington. "Do you remember what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington clenched his teeth, fully aware of what was coming. Jalen did not give him a chance to answer. Instead, he took a written transcript from his files and read it aloud. "I left my car running while I walked into the gas station. Some child must have jumped in and fled, but it wasn't the one you arrested. I saw the child, and he was white." A collective scream rang around the courtroom. Jalen held the document up. "That's from the original police report, which the prosecution conveniently ignored." He returned to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer left this out of his evidence. The prosecution ignored it. And now they expect this jury to think that I, someone who doesn't even fit the description of the actual thief, is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" Carrington came forward, flustered. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle," Jalen said, shaking his head. "No." His voice did not raise, yet it rang across the courtroom with accuracy. "I was nabbed streets away from the abandoned car while walking home from grabbing snacks with my buddies. I wasn't in or near the automobile. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing linking me to this case is a lack in police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson took a deep breath and rubbed his temple. The case was unraveling quickly, and everyone could see. Jalen told the jurors. The true suspect fled that night. The cops discovered a black child nearby and felt that was enough. That's what this case genuinely represents. Silence ensued. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "Does the prosecution have anything else?" Carrington seemed strained, and his face reddened. "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson sighed. focusing his eyes on Jalen for a long minute before returning his attention to the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke words that would stay with everyone present. "Case dismissed." A startled stillness fell over the room, followed by turmoil. Half the courtroom exploded, some in astonishment, others in silent relief. The gallery shuffled, and reporters quickly scrawled in their notebooks. Jalen didn't rush to move. Instead, he let the moment settle, allowing everyone time to grasp the fact. Judge Grayson, still grasping his gavel, looked at Jalen with an enigmatic expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen kept his eyes for a while before turning to go. But as he approached the door, the judge yelled out again, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen paused but did not turn. Grayson stopped before saying, "You should consider law school." Jalen laughed. He didn't need to think about it. He was already on that route. Outside the courthouse, shouting filled the air as reporters jammed the steps, their cameras blazing and mics pointing forward like guns. "Jalen, did you anticipate that the court would dismiss the case? What are the next steps? How does it feel to outwit a seasoned prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the avalanche of inquiries. He wasn't very interested in the show. This wasn't just about demonstrating his brilliance. It was about much more. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed and her countenance inscrutable. For a long time, she just stared at him before shaking her head and exhaling. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, stroking the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She paused for a second before wrapping him in a tight embrace. "You've always been the stubborn one." The cameras continued to flash, but Jalen was no longer looking at them. Judge Grayson's tone changed as he watched from his automobile across the street. The arrogance was gone, and his gaze was devoid of amusement. It expressed something deeper, similar to pondering. He had not expected this case to go beyond the standard. Simply another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. Now he recognized he would remember this event because Jalen had accomplished what few others could. He pushed the system to think on itself. And, for once, the system reacted first. Here's the takeaway. How many other situations have unfolded in this manner? How many people were convicted without substantial evidence because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that valued concluding cases above learning the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about others who did not? This wasn't just about one case. It applied to all of them. He knew what lay ahead. This would not be his last court appearance. But he would not be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when the time came, he wouldn't be alone in his quest. If this story connects with you, even for a little time, please share it. The legal system is based on laws, but it is run by people, and individuals can change if we encourage them to do so. Hit the like button, subscribe for more important news, and let's keep the dialogue going, because next time it might not be Jalen. It may be someone you know.